So, 今天用英文上课吗？
Sure.
If I can use English, I'll be so much more comfortable. So I think I'll start with English because if you're here, that means you can use English to teach. So that must mean I can use English to speak to you, and I can relax a little bit. Great. Actually, I don't think I'm the best one to talk today because I think if I were to talk to you about me using Chinese to teach, then maybe I have something more to share. But anyway, I hope you just consider this as just some random thoughts about what might make it easier to communicate with students using English in, say, at Central University here. And so let me just jump in. I didn't give a lot of order to them. I think I'll start out with an anecdote. When I was a graduate student at University of Illinois in Urbana, I had a friend from Taiwan studying economics, I remember him clearly. He was a friend of mine, but I also remember reading in the school newspaper. I also remember reading in the school newspaper when they report the excellent teachers, a list of excellent teachers, and he was an excellent teacher, chosen by his students as an excellent teacher in economics. And after that, I realized he got that regularly, not just one semester, but the students always chose him as an excellent teacher. He was a PhD student at the time. So I remember I asked him, because we were working with some TAs. I was in English education, so we were trying to help teaching assistants. So I asked for his insight. What's the secret? It's your second language, but it's just the American students chose you as an excellent teacher. And I remember he only told me one thing, and I remember it now. He said, "Don't worry about English." He said, he tells himself, that's what he tells himself, and he tells the other foreign teachers in America. He said, I'm an economics TA, I'm not an English TA. My expertise, I don't claim to be an English expert. That's not why I'm here. I claim to know something about economics. So I'm going to make English mistakes, and they have to accept that, even if at first they don't accept that. My job is that I let them know it doesn't matter. My English is not perfect, and that's not my job. And I thought that was really a wonderful insight because it gave him confidence. He didn't have to give himself pressure to be an English expert. That's not his area. So I'll start out with that. And I think that's a very wonderful assumption to begin with. If you're teaching anything in a second or third language, I tell myself that when I use Chinese too. I'm very kind to myself. I know I'll make a lot of mistakes, but I don't claim to be an expert in that. So assume that your students have to adjust to you. I think that's a very good one, and it takes pressure out too. First I want to say I'm very happy about the idea that teachers are considering and are actually using English to teach here, because to me that's the best way they can learn English. And in fact, we've talked to the Jiaowudang, and he's already very supportive of what we want to do with the Language Center in the next generation. And we want to expand the Language Center, including what we do now. We also want to start some English-enriched courses. And there's a reason. We want their biology or their calculus or their chemistry or economics course to give them a chance to get exposed to English. And there's a reason for that, for English, because that's the best way to learn English. You learn something you need, and not just because it's English as a dead subject, but when you really need it for communication. You know, a language is a tool for communicating. And the best way for students to learn it is really in the situation where it's needed. So we really want to start developing courses in the different colleges where it's the course from that college, but it's English is an enriched part of it. So that might include lecturing in English, or writing their homework in English, more reading in English. So I think this is wonderful that the professors here are interested in teaching in English. I think this is great for the students. They're lucky. I'll talk about some factors that make English lectures hard or easy to follow. What I'm doing is I'm assuming what you care about is making your ideas or your content clear to the students when you're using English. And so I won't go through all of these, but I think there are some ideas from information theory that will help us about the idea of when is language hard for students, or when is a lecture hard for students. And here are some questions. What makes a language in another, a lecture in another language easy or difficult? It's not just the language. There are many things that make a lecture hard or easy. I think we all have experience of listening to a lecture in our best language. In Chinese for you, maybe, or English for me, but I can't understand. So language is not the only thing that makes something hard to understand. There are certain ways of lecturing that make it easier, not just the language. If we can control them, then we can make the language part actually not so torturous, not so hard. Under what conditions do learners learn language best? I think I'll have something to say about that. What are the conditions? And this one, I'm afraid I'll forget about it, so let me say something now. The relative independence of language skills. Here's what I want to mention. In Taiwan, I think students at university, their reading is not bad. I mean, compared to their speaking. I mean, their reading is not bad. And there are reasons for that, because you can learn to read in a very safe environment. You can learn to read in your privacy of your own home, and no one knows if you make a mistake. But if you speak, you have to speak to someone. They hear your mistakes, so it's very risky. So I think we can understand why students' reading is better. They're willing to practice with no risk. Right? They can get better and make mistakes. No one knows they make mistakes in reading. But when it comes to lecturing them, we have to realize to know a word or a phrase in English is really a false idea. You know it in many ways. So maybe a word that I know when I read, I've never heard it. Yeah, I've never heard it spoken. I've only seen it in writing. So when I see it, it's very familiar to me. Maybe it's a term in my major, like biology, like in vivo or in vitro or something. I know it. But when I hear someone say it, it's like a complete stranger. I have no idea that that sound matches that written word. So when you're lecturing, I think it's important to realize, even though your students might know these words, if they know them in writing, that doesn't mean they know them when they hear them. Okay, so we can't assume once their reading goes up that their listening goes up with it. It's quite independent. Okay, here I think is the main thing I wanted to convey today. What makes lectures difficult or easy for students? There are two dimensions. There are many, but two dimensions we can control. One is the language. And so we can use very familiar language if we're listeners. If I hear something in words that I know very well, or simpler words, then it's easier for me to listen to the lecture. And so a scale from familiar to unfamiliar words. So the higher we go, the harder it is to understand the lecture, the harder the language. But there's another dimension, and that is the content, the ideas. And those can go from familiar ideas to unfamiliar ideas. Okay? And so this gives us a sort of way of looking at things that are on this side will be the easiest ones. That is, this will be familiar ideas expressed in familiar words. But those are two dimensions, familiar ideas expressed in familiar words. And the hardest dimension is over here. This would be, the hardest would be unfamiliar ideas, and I'm using unfamiliar words. This would be the hardest. Now, I think this is a very potent, there's a lot of power in this, because as a lecturer, I can control these things. So one of the biggest challenges in lecturing in English is this. Here are my students in chemistry course or biology course. Okay? And the reason they're there is to learn chemistry. That means there's a lot about chemistry that they are unfamiliar with. So the reason they're coming to me is because I'm supposed to tell them this stuff, unfamiliar ideas. That's why they're here to learn, because they don't know, right? So that's why they're here. And now I'm doing it in English, so I'm using unfamiliar words. So almost everything in my lecture is going to be here, right? And that's really unfortunate. That's really too bad, because that makes it hard for everyone, okay, for the teacher. So here's what I'm recommending. We can be flexible about this. Okay, so I think not no one here plans to use 100% English in lecturing. Maybe, but maybe not. I think we can decide, right? When do I use Chinese? When do I use English? And here's what I suggest is if you're dealing with unfamiliar ideas, a new chapter or something these students never saw before, very new, you can consider two things. One is use Chinese. So, what would be, go ahead and use Chinese about these very unfamiliar ideas. Because I think in every lecture there's a difference. Sometimes I'm reviewing things they know from last year or from last week, right? I'm reviewing. And sometimes I'm throwing out a completely new idea that they haven't read before. So, when I'm dealing with unfamiliar ideas, I can consider two things. If I'm using English, I should try to use English that's as simple as possible, as simple that they're already familiar with. Because here's the paradox: an unfamiliar idea needs a name, okay, like I don't know, mitosis. I don't know. An unfamiliar idea needs a name, and usually the name is also unfamiliar because it's a new name for a new idea, right? So that's unfamiliar language and unfamiliar. But go ahead and do that, but come back to simpler language. Use everyday or simpler terms that they already know to explain unfamiliar concepts as much as possible. So then you're not up here, you're more like down here. And this is easier to understand than this, right? This is, okay. So if the idea is new, do the best you can is use familiar language. The other way is to decide when to use English. When do I really emphasize English? And I would suggest if you don't use English all the time, and use it sometimes, you have to decide when. And here's an idea. Use English when you're talking about familiar ideas. The ideas the students already know. Why? Because you're controlling this, right? English is already unfamiliar, already makes it hard, right? So use it for things that they already know, content they already know. So maybe review last week, or review a previous chapter, and you can use English because they know the ideas, or they should know the ideas. Okay. Any questions about this, the general concept here, about you have two dimensions to control?
So Professor Piper, right, so you are saying that you suggest that to use two languages to teach them, either that between to choose, not totally English.
No, I'm saying, I would say that's up to the professor. That would be up to you. Because some professors would like to use 100% English. And I think there are a lot of good things to say about that. In fact, for example, even if your students complain at the beginning,
Always.
So I think if you're here, that means you're 脸皮已经很厚。不用说服人家。Okay, so these are already the very brave teachers who don't care if the students complain, right? So there's a lot to.
Also that you know that your evaluation, so you will get a good one.
So this is extra brave, right? So right. Okay, so this is a very special group. Great teachers. But let me say something about that. If you insist on using English, what happens then is over time, throughout the semester, you probably already have this experience, you're always giving new ideas, because every week you're supposed to teach them some new biology or some new chemistry. Okay, that's always. But this can start here at the beginning of the semester, but then the same words, they heard them last week and they heard them 3 weeks. Okay, so if you insist on using English a lot or 100%, they're going to, over time, this will get easier and easier. Even though they're the same language, they'll be getting more and more familiar. But if you use a lot of Chinese because you're afraid they don't understand, then the English will stay up here, right, longer. It'll stay up here longer. So it's 有一点先苦后甘. So if you can just get them to be patient and realize by the end, they'll get the rewards because it'll start to be familiar. But I still would leave it up to the professor. I don't know if the school has a policy, but I think the professor should be free to use. Now, I do have one suggestion though. If a professor mixes Chinese and English, I have a very concrete suggestion. I think I'll jump ahead to talk about this. Let me say this. If you are thinking of mixing sometimes Chinese with English, there's something very important to be careful about when we do this, okay? And that is using words in context. Because here's what often happens with me when I mix Chinese and English. In linguistics, we do an analysis of a phenomenon called code switching or code mixing. Two codes like English and Chinese, and we mix them in a conversation. Okay, sometimes I throw in a word. But usually there's a host language. I'm speaking English, but putting in Chinese. Or am I speaking Chinese and putting in English? You're like a host, or a guest language, right? Now, you have to sort of be conscious if you're mixing. Am I speaking mostly in English? Is my all in English with some Chinese once in a while? Or the other way? Now, for the sake of their English, what's very important is that you give them enough context for the words. Here's what I'm saying. If I'm speaking Chinese and throwing in some English, okay, then I'll probably throw in nouns and once in a while verbs, keywords, nouns and verbs. I'll throw in, okay. 所以我可以说，今天我现在我讲国语，然后我丢一点英文，比如说 OK， 今天的实验我们发现有一个 result。OK， 那 result 就是一个名词出来，对不对？那个英文的名词。But here's what happens. If I'm using Chinese and I throw in some English, I might feel like I'm using a lot of English in my lecture because I throw in lots of nouns that are English, right? But here's the problem, is if you want the students to grasp the language, a word of a language is not an independent thing. It grows from a context. 所以我掌握某一个生字，不是掌握它跟它的定义，而是掌握它的使用的一些习惯。比如说这个名词前面平常用词的动词。Okay, so we have a phenomenon called collocation, 搭配子。Okay. Let's talk about this one first. So if we take a word like experiment, and I'm throwing this word in, the word experiment, I use a lot. But I might hear my professor say the word experiment a lot, but I never hear what are the words. Design an experiment, conduct an experiment. 这些动词跟那个名词的拼法怎么发音一样重要。Yeah. Otherwise they're stuck with a noun and they're always going to have Chinglish because they don't know what verb to use with a noun, right? So they always have to rely on Chinese, or it will be some wrong English one. Okay, like write my homework. 写功课. But in English we can't write homework, we have to do homework. 医生可以开药, but you don't open medicine. 吃药, we don't eat medicine, we take medicine, right? So if you're mixing Chinese and English, let me just emphasize it's very important that you use larger chunks of English so that they know for a key noun, it's not enough they recognize that noun. They have to know which verbs go with it, or which adjectives. Experiment, a successful experiment, right? Or a duplicated experiment. These adjectives that go with these key nouns, etc. Or something like result, here I said a reported result. I can reproduce a result. These are very important verbs that go with these nouns. So, if you're mixing language, I would suggest paying attention to the context of it and give enough English context, even if you're using a lot of Chinese. Okay? And it might take some conscious effort because it's easier if you're using mixing to sort of just use the key word and use Chinese for the rest. But, the other thing is countability. If you're just using key words, what happens is 我可以忽略它是可数不可数的这个区别. Because in Chinese we don't have this distinction, right? And so if I'm using a lot of Chinese and I put in English, what happens in code mixing? That part of English grammar disappears when I put it into a Chinese discourse. But there's a very important part of English grammar, right? So I don't just have these words. I have to let my students know, is experiment countable or not countable? So can I have experiments? Yes. But I can't have equipments, right? I can have a piece of equipment. So if you're putting just keywords in, they'll miss the chance to say equipment 的话，如果是 more than one, 到底怎么描述 a piece of equipment or several pieces of equipment or a lot of equipment. These are all very important. So I jumped to this when you asked about the mixing the languages. This is, I would say, a key. I think another distinction we can make, useful distinction, is between meta-language versus domain language. Meta-language we could sort of call management language. Okay? And this kind of language could be common across all colleges and all domains. And this is language like, let me give you a few examples. Okay? So I will say this whether I'm in humanities or in biology or in accounting, right? I can use sentences like this. But this becomes very important. So if you're mixing language, often what happens is I do all this kind of work in Chinese. I use the students' best language to say, 我先举几个例子. Okay, so I use Chinese to manage the course, but then I use English for some key ideas, right? But I think actually, if you use this in English, it's very useful. Why? Because if we go back to familiar and non-familiar, let me give you a few examples. 这几个例子都可以一直重用，每一个礼拜大概好几次可以用， and then it will become very familiar. And so the students will realize that for you, these are management words. So these management words, if you use them in English, it really makes it much easier to do lots in English, right? If you do the managing in English. I took a lot of high school French, and I never needed it, so I forgot most of them. But I still remember, ouvrez le livre. Why? Open your book. So it's management language, but my teacher would always say in French. So the most French I remember is not all the stuff she gave on a test. It's the stuff she said, fermez le livre, close your books, open your books. You know, and these sort of things. So that's what so this is a wonderful opportunity for them to learn, even though it's not the highlight of what their content, right? It's not the content, but it's wonderful. So you could even make some handouts if you want. If you have a lot of key phrases or expressions, you can do this. Let me give you an overview. Let's review something. Notice something. Notice table 5 on page 23. Any questions? Feel free to ask questions. Okay, yeah. Good luck. Right? So, do you see the point of this data? So everyone has their own lecturing style, so this list will be different for every professor, but I think if you have these and you notice, try to reuse them as much as you can, and they'll start to feel like, hey, I really understand English. Even though it's in a few weeks they'll get these, right? And they'll really feel like a sense of achievement. Let me tell you something I do with this. Notice table 5 on page 23. When I used to teach a English conversation class, I had a big problem because I always have to think of something to talk about. 语言的课的问题说你要教语言，可是语言一定要谈内容，对不对？那你们是相反，你们有丰富的内容，然后你要套上语言比较方便。It's much easier. I really envy you. Okay. So what I would do is I would have them bring their the English major 膝盖的课本. I would say next week bring your Western literature textbook. And they will wonder for conversation class what? And then, so the reason I would say turn to page 572. And 我有一本 572. And then it was like, they have to listen to the number, right?
Translate.
Yeah, and quickly. Yeah. And they have to really do something, and you turn it, and I'll find out, okay, read the first word, read the first sentence. 为什么考膝盖吗？没有，考他们的英文的听力。523 听不懂，第几页听不懂，听不懂。So you can, they all have the same textbook in your class. So in the first few weeks, you can give them a little 听力. So, okay, turn to page 271. Read the first sentence. 那是跟化学有关系？没有，就是你听不懂日文。And you'll find out if you do that for 5 minutes, do this 10 times, right? They'll start to feel. Yeah, the first 3 times they're suffering, right? And then by the 4th time, 5th time, it really, they get into it. The feel of it, the rhythm of it. So some things you use often, you can create some little fun quizzes for them. I think the last thing, because we have a lot of others to share, is this. I don't have a good answer for this, but here's the problem. We need to keep track of how much the students are following us. How much they're following us. Because I found out students who don't respond, or I say, do you understand, and they don't do anything. That doesn't mean they do understand, and it doesn't mean they don't understand. It means 不敢有反应. So I think we all need to devise some techniques for finding out if the students really are following things I say. And if not, then what makes it hard? Okay. Well, what are the difficulties? Is it the content, or is it the language? And the last point I would like to make, I think I have a question, is multimodal lecturing. This has to do with information theory. When I just put this slide up, you looked at it, and you can read that. And I said it, multimodal lecturing. But if I didn't have this slide, and I said multimodal lecturing, the burden on you is heavier, because you have to completely depend on your ears.
Yeah.
But I gave you two chances, your ears and your eyes. And so, not only is it easier to understand, but you're learning. Well, not you, but if you were students, you'd be learning. Why? If I don't give you that, or you close your eyes and say, multimodal lecturing, you might be completely lost. There's no kind of, so you learn nothing. If you have nothing, you learn nothing. But if this is a kind of what we call a hook, or a scaffold, you need some help, and you look here, and then you hear me say multimodal lecturing, you know what you do? You learn how to hear this term. And next time, you don't see it, and I say, you will understand it. So the idea of multimodal lecturing is giving them many channels, visual and auditory. Because if you only use your spoken word, and they don't have other signals, the burden on their listening is too heavy. And not only they lose the information, but they use the chance to learn the language. So the advantages here. So multimodal lecturing is using more than one mode or channel. So we can have visual, but visual could be text, image, live demos. I think there's a lot of room for creativity, because even just good teaching, even if it's not with English, this is true, right? They learn better by many different channels of input, right? So you can think of visually, that could be text on a screen, like this is visual for you, but it could be pictures of it. So even if they look at it and they don't understand it, if you can give some image of it. So I used the chart, the 2 dimensions earlier, right? I used the chart because I realized visually, if you can get the ideas, that's better than just text alone. So text plus image plus audio, my speech. If I put together these 3 things, your chances of grasping something are much better than I give you only this, or only this, or only this. So think of this as reducing the burden on your spoken message. Okay? The more other ways you give the same information at the same time, 2 things. They don't have so much anxiety. 听不懂没有关系，可以看得懂。The other is they can learn the listening. 最难的可能是听的吧。So if you don't give them any of these and only this, 就是赶不上，那赶不上一直在零。But if they have all this, they understand a little bit. And if you get a little bit, you can get a little more. And when you get a little more, you can get even more. Like say the rich get richer. And others, depending on your field, even tactile, hands-on experience in the lab. Okay, you can tell them, okay, can you smell the formaldehyde? Can you smell that? Okay, that smell is called pungent, or you can use smells, textures, etc. When I talk about multimodal learning, I want to tell you one story and then I'll stop. It's about once I had just graduated from high school. I was at a banquet in Chicago, and at my table there were 2 surgeons, a husband and wife. They were both neurosurgeons. Okay, they're really well-respected surgeons in Chicago. And there was beside me there was a woman whose daughter wanted to become a surgeon. And at the meal she started asking right away, okay, so what do I need to worry about? 她的 biology 的成绩什么这个? And they said, do you think she has a chance, or what do I need to worry about? And I remember the husband, he said, is she ambidextrous? Ambidextrous means 左右手一样灵活吗? He didn't ask about her biology grade. He didn't ask, is she hard? He asked, can her both? Why? Because surgeons need 2 hands. So in a lot of our fields, we emphasize sort of head learning. But even 最高级是医学嘛，我们认为大概医学是最，他第一个问题说，他的手灵不灵活？ Okay. So multimodal learning, even not only for learning English, but also for learning their field. Sometimes you have to get them more involved in using other senses. I think I'll stop here.